I'm going to call this lunch discussion to order. It is my pleasure to introduce what keeps you up at night. Because if my existing nightmares weren't enough, I'd like some fresh ones. So thank you, Rick. Allow me to briefly introduce myself. I'm Sarah Wallace Goodman, Associate Professor of Political Science here at UCI, and co-director for the Jack W. Peltison Center for the Study of Democracy, which is proud to help support this event. Louder. No one has ever told me to be louder. Okay. CSD is an interdisciplinary organized research unit here on campus, and we are happy to support faculty and graduate students researching democratic institutions, questions of inclusion and participation, as well as problems of democracy. We have a number of programs on the docket for the remaining quarter and upcoming spring quarter that we want to flag for you. On March 12th, we have, as part of our Eckstein lecture, Suzanne Mettler from Cornell, who's going to be here to talk about 4 threats, the recurring crises of American democracy. And on April 17th, we have a conference about citizens and democratic hard times. So we recognize the importance of the discussions taking place here today, and we thank you all for traveling in and having this conversation together at this a critical juncture in our country's democracy. I'm happy to introduce the 2 panelists for this lunch discussion, moderated by our fearless leader, Rick. Jocelyn is, I'm gonna start with Frank, because he's here. Jocelyn's on her way in. Home court advantage, okay. Frank LaRose took office as Ohio's 51st Secretary of State on January 14th last year. He served 2 terms in the state Senate prior to being elected to statewide office. In his role as Ohio's Chief Elections Officer, he was working to ensure Ohio's elections are secure, accessible, and accurate. After graduating from Copley High School, Akron, for those of you, LaRose enlisted in the United States Army with the 101st Airborne and ultimately served in the U.S. Special Forces as a Green Beret. During his decade in uniform around the globe, LaRose received numerous commendations and honors, including the Bronze Star. Now let me also introduce Jocelyn Benson, Michigan's 43rd Secretary of State and author of State Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process. Her focus for the Department of State is ensuring all citizens have equal access to the participation necessary to sustain our democracy. A graduate of Harvard Law School and expert on civil rights law, education law, and election law, Benson served as Dean of Wayne State University's Law School. Additionally, she now serves as Vice Chair of the Advisory Board for the Levin Center at Wayne Law, which she co-founded with former U.S. Senator Carl Levin. Now, they say we are more divided and rancorous than ever, but the peaceful assembly here of a Wolverine and a Buckeye is evidence to the contrary. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. I think it's unusual just to have a Democratic and Republican elected officials sitting together talking about these things. I know you kind of have a little dog and pony show. You guys go around and talk about this around the country. And so you're kind of the poster children for why we should have confidence in the process. You weren't here this morning, but we've heard a lot of things that have given people some concern. From issues related to cybersecurity, to issues related to holes in our election laws, to concerns about disinformation. Recent NPR poll found that over 40% of the public is worried their votes are not going to be safe and secure. So without talking about platitudes, talking specifically about what's going on in your states, can you each talk a little bit about why we should be confident that in the election process in November?
Well, one, I think there's just more eyes and focus on it than ever before. I know many of you in this room, I've known you for almost 2 decades now as we've done this work in different forms, and what we've seen is an increase in focus from a legal standpoint, policy standpoint, and just activist standpoint on the way elections are operated. And what I've seen now on this side as the Secretary of State is that is translating into a significant more expertise-driven approach to election administration at the local level as well as at the state level. And so it's great because accountability is a good thing, and I think there's more accountability than ever before. When I started doing this work shortly after the 2000 election, like many of us, there was not a lot of focus on the election administrator oftentimes as a key component of the elections process. Now that focus is significant, and that scrutiny is significant. And as a result, we're all working overtime to make sure competence leads how we do our work, that we're making data-driven decisions, that we're being solution-oriented. And frankly, one of the things that Secretary LaRose and I focus on and immediately connected on when we were both elected was the importance of demonstrating civility in the political arena in general and in the area of election administration specifically. So we're not unique in that regard. We're neighbors, and it is, we've sort of leaned into the fact that we're very similar, and yet there are all these sort of perceived sort of ways in which we should be different or on opposing sides, but we're all just committed to making sure government works better for all of our citizens, and that in particular, elections are an accurate reflection of the will of the people.
Thanks for the question, Rick, and I agree with Jocelyn that the increased focus is important to this, but also, there's a sort of a pre-2016, post-2016 mindset when it comes to matters of election security, cybersecurity, combating disinformation. We in Ohio are taking this matter very seriously. I can tell you that we've introduced a 34-point checklist that our boards of elections have worked through, and they've all now become compliant with that, and that's something that we've worked very hard to do. And in many ways, that's sort of an example of how seriously we're taking this, but also combating disinformation. We're working to educate members of the press, to educate certain communities, to recognize disinformation efforts and how to combat those. And the underlying principle behind all of that is that the best antidote to a lie is the truth. And so we have a lot of good truth to tell about how well run elections are. Go visit any county board of elections and you'll find dedicated professionals that care deeply about the work that they do. They may not be cybersecurity experts. They may not be experts at natural disaster recovery. They may not be experts, but they are people that care deeply about this democratic exercise, that normal people get to pick their leaders. And they bring that dedication to the work they do. And in Ohio, these are all bipartisan teams, these county boards of elections, half Republican, half Democrat. And as you pointed out, it feels like we live in a time when Republicans and Democrats can't agree that today's Friday. But we have county boards of elections all over Ohio that do that work together, and that's something that's worth pointing out.
So what do you think specifically are the greatest threats facing the integrity of the 2020 election, whether that's in your state or in another state? Because for a successful presidential election, it might be your state that's pivotal, but it might be somewhere else. What are you seeing around the country that's keeping you up at night, to use the terminology of the panel's title?
Well, I mean, frankly, in my view, the biggest threats that I see are misinformation, efforts to confuse voters about their rights, about what's at stake in an election, the overall political discourse right now, and the effort to cause voters to question the integrity of the process as a political strategy without any data to back it up. And I think it's frustrating because we work every day to ensure that competence-led elections and a data-driven approach to administration is what rules the day, and to lead our states and our localities with that vision. And it is challenging to do so in an environment where there are people on both sides seeking to sow discord and disinformation about what's at stake in an election, what people stand for, and even just the validity of the process itself. And it's what's, I wouldn't say it's what keeps me up at night. I have a 3-year-old. That's what keeps me up at night. I know Rick is the same, but gladly I adore him. But that said, the frustrating thing about this role for me has been just how partisanship and party maneuvering holds back good progress and decision making that is voter centric, and regardless of the affiliation of the voters.
If I could just follow up just on one point. To the extent that the misinformation involves how to vote, when to vote, where to vote, does your office have a specific strategy, a social media strategy? I mean, how are you approaching these kind of challenges?
Well, Secretary LaRose has really taken. We've all taken this on. I think he's got some great specific examples, so I want to defer to him. But also mention that all the secretaries of state with NAS, the National Association of Secretary of State, have coordinated this campaign called the Trusted Info Campaign 2020 to really drive home that the way to get trusted, reliable information about elections and the administration of elections is through the websites of our secretaries of state itself, to really amplify our role as the election experts and officials in our states, and the source of trusted information, as opposed to non-government organizations that may not, many of, as we all know, I've worked with many of them, are well focused in intention, but oftentimes those unaffiliated with our official offices are have bad intentions in mind, and are we're using our credibility as state office holders to combat that.
Yeah, so the first question was, what's the single biggest threat? And to me, it's voter confidence. I've had the chance to travel to a lot of parts of the world where people don't have confidence that elections matter, and they shouldn't, right? Because they're not well run and that kind of thing. But that's never been the case, at least in recent memory, in recent history in the United States. And there's this, I think one of the most important things that happens in American democracy happens at like 10:30, 11 o'clock on election night. And that is when the loser says, I lost. I'm going to call the winner and congratulate her. Or when the winner says, congratulations, I'm going to go out and give a speech, that kind of thing. And this idea that we sort of question the validity of an election if the person we were backing loses is a very dangerous and slippery slope. I wrote something on the dry erase board in my chief of staff's office, and it's kind of become our rallying cry in the office, and that is that when the people of Ohio go to bed on election night, they will go to bed knowing that they saw a fair election that reflected the true will of the people of Ohio, and they will have, whether their person won or lost, they'll have no reason to call into question the validity of that election. So voter confidence. I think that everything that we're doing together as a team and everything that each of us are doing separately in our home states is all based on that idea that people should go confidently to the polls, and they should know that when they turn on their favorite television station or go to the website or whatever else on election night, they're going to see a true contest. Part of the way that we're doing that is this work that we're doing together on our voter confidence project, and one of those things is that we've taken the stand that when we took the oath of office to serve in this capacity, we sort of put the referee's jersey on. We don't play for one team or another. I'm a proud Republican, she's a proud Democrat. We both believe in the things our parties stand for, but in the work that we do as elections officials, there is no partisanship. I don't endorse candidates. I don't appear at rallies. I don't do any of those things because it just.
Some of your predecessors have, though.
Yeah, some have, and I think we've
from
learned
both parties.
Sure, and we've learned from that in many ways too, and so that's part of it. But also actively combating disinformation. So this was sort of the second question that you had. We've set up for lack of a better term, a sort of a war room operation where we're monitoring things that people are saying on social media. I'll give you an example. Last year, for our municipal election, sort of our first test run at this, there was a person going around with his iPhone claiming that he was voting multiple times. Well, what he was doing was submitting provisional ballots at different places, and obviously they wouldn't have all counted, only the one at his proper polling location. We found this person within 20 minutes of him posting this. We were on the phone with him and having a very serious conversation about the consequences of his actions, right? That's the kind of thing that we just have decided that we have to be proactive about. That individual ended up making a tearful apology in front of the County Board of Elections just a couple weeks ago because he thought he was going to go out there and make himself internet famous on this, and what we explained to him that he was doing is harming the trust that people have in the very foundation of our democracy. That's a serious matter, and so those are the kind of things that we're doing. Jocelyn mentioned that we have a few other things underway. We do what we call Elections 101 training at our boards of elections, where we invite members of the press and members of the public to come in. I've got another one coming up in a week or so in Youngstown, Ohio. And it's a 2-hour session. It's everything you ever wanted to know about how elections run. And it's specifically targeted at journalists because everybody I know in the profession of journalism cares deeply about getting the information right. But most of them have never worked behind the counter at the Board of Elections. And so they're not elections experts. They don't understand how post-election audits work. They don't understand logic and accuracy testing, all this stuff that we all know about, and that those of us that work in elections. And so we do that training for them because it helps them be better at their job, but also to help them prepare to not themselves be the victims of a targeted disinformation campaign, which we've seen targeting members of the press. The final thing that I wanted to mention that we're doing is we know, and this is a fact, that unfortunately, minority communities, communities of color in general, new American communities have been targeted more than any other for these foreign disinformation campaigns. And mostly it's all about getting people to not show up and vote, getting people choosing to self-disenfranchise, if you will, is the term that I use. And so we've been holding workshops with recognized community leaders because the trusted voices need to come from someone within that community. And we run through a full presentation of how to spot disinformation, understanding what's going on. I mean, take a bunch of black ministers and bring them to a place and start showing them the videos of some of these things that are happening. Tell them the story about somebody organizing a Black Lives Matter rally at the same location as a white supremacist rally, all as an effort to cause discord and people's eyes start to open up. And so, again, working to work with those communities so that they can recognize disinformation and then immediately push back at it, and building that network of people that can be the voice to say, no, this is not true. You should go out and vote, and your vote will be counted.
Yeah, and to underscore, I think there's a crucial role that secretaries of state, frankly, only can play in that regard because of the position we occupy and the official capacity that we hold. And I think that's what you're going to see this cycle more than ever before. Our community, our colleagues leaning in many cases, like we are doing in Michigan and Ohio, to define, to demystify the process, and to use the authority of our office to fight back against efforts to confuse our citizens.
I want to remind people in the audience that we'll be collecting question cards in a few minutes if you have questions for the panel. One of the things, Secretary LaRose, you said in your first answer was you're talking about how good local election officials were, but that they're not cybersecurity experts. And one of the things we heard on an earlier panel is that it's tough when you're a local election official and you're going up against, say, the Russian army. And so is decentralization a problem when it comes to election security? Is the fact that we deal with this, everywhere from DHS to the smallest county in your state, does that create a problem?
So you're right to mention that, folks didn't sign up for a war with the Russians or the North Koreans or the Chinese or the Iranians. I actually said this in front of the Ohio Association of Elections Officials a couple months ago at their conference. I said, you all signed up, some of you 3 years ago, some of you 3 decades ago. The people that work in elections signed up because they wanted to run fair elections for their neighbors. They wanted to be involved in making sure that in their community there was a fair election going on, and maybe they were, interested in advancing that. But none of them signed up to wage a fight for the very sort of integrity of our democracy. But that's the fight that we have, and I know that these individuals are up to the challenge. So the question is, does decentralization help or hurt that? Decentralization of elections is not a quirk, it's a feature. I mean, it's the way that we run elections in this country. There are 50 states that each run their own elections. Most of them then further decentralize it down to the county level, even more so in Michigan, where you guys have 1,500 individuals that are running elections throughout the state. But does it add challenges? Yes, it does. I've got counties that are 2 people that work in the courthouse basement, and I've got counties with 150. And I've got counties with 150 people at their Board of Elections. And so those are challenges, but we can address those. Upsetting the apple cart and changing the way that we run elections to centralize the entire administration of it is not something that I would propose. I can tell you, though, that we can take advantage of economies of scale, and there are things that we can do at a statewide level, and there's work that we can do with our federal partners, but that doesn't mean that we need to take the actual administration of elections over as a statewide or certainly as a national function.
And Secretary Benson, before you answer that, let me put it in the context of the 2016 election, before you were in office, I'll make that clear, where Green Party candidate Jill Stein had requested a statewide recount of the presidential vote, and it went so poorly in the city of Detroit that they basically could not conduct a recount because the numbers didn't match between those that were reported as to the number of ballots and the ballots actually that were cast. do you wish you had more control over what's going on so that those places that are having trouble, either because they lack resources or training, get more help from the state and maybe under more control of the state?
I think it's a constant, delicate balance between recognizing the fact that an election in Alpena is going to be different than an election in Detroit versus Houghton, Michigan, and Grand Rapids, all over. So there's a critical role for local influence and administration to play, as Secretary LaRose was just pointing out. The challenge is accountability for when, so it's a constant partnership with at the local level and at the federal level. My challenge is the fact that in Michigan, everyone is locally elected. So whereas in Ohio, I believe you appoint with a kind of group of individuals, and you have that accountability if a policy or a mandate or an expectation is not met. We don't have that in Michigan. The voters hold that accountability, and so that's key. Recognizing that my office does have the power to set certain standards with vendors, which we've been exercising more this time than has been done in the past, and also to set expectations for poll workers by, we're actually approaching it as a workforce development issue. We need more talent, we need more expertise, we need better training for our poll workers across the state, and recognize that as a statewide responsibility. But in everything we do in the latter regard in particular, we have to walk a delicate balance between respecting the local authority that these local elected officials and office holders hold as clerks or administrators, and approaching everything as I've done with the view that we're all in this together. I say all the time, democracy is a team sport. Every one of us have a role to play in making sure our elections run well for all of our voters, and I've found that approach is the most successful, and having incentives that I can use, as opposed to mandates and accountability, incentivizing effective leadership through grants and other types of resources that I do have at my disposal and that the federal government helps us with as well. That's been an effective way to kind of get where we need to be. But there are so many players that affect this. I can talk about the legislature as well as another factor, another variable in our ability to be effective administrators, as well as, again, the legislative funding at the state level for all this work.
Rick, one more thing on the centralization and decentralization question. There's a big trust element in this too, and poll after poll shows you that we tend to trust our local authorities a lot more than we do our state and our federal. The trust decreases the higher it goes up the food chain, so to speak, in government. And so keeping something as fundamental as elections administration controlled at the local level is important for trust as well.
And on that note, what I've also found is that everyone who's elected at the local level wants to get reelected, for the most part, right? So it is in everyone's incentive. The Detroit City Clerk is an example of that, but everyone's is incentivized through their own professional goals to do well, and we leverage that, and that's where transparency and information to our voters about what's working, what's not, is important.
So I want to turn to voter registration and list maintenance. I think you've probably both been sued.
Many times.
It's Friday, so you're probably sued again.
Sure.
So first, turning to Secretary LaRose, your state, I think this was before you were in office, won a Supreme Court case that made it easier to purge voters from the rolls. The question is, how do you balance the potential for disenfranchisement with the need to have accurate lists? What is your response to Democrats who believe that voter purges are too aggressive and that really it's these administrative procedures are really attempts to disenfranchise people?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So you're right, that lawsuit that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court was during my predecessor, and what it did was upheld what has been in place in Ohio for 2 decades. This has become a partisan issue more in the last few years than it had been previously. I mean, in Ohio, both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state have carried out this process. So when Jennifer Brunner was Secretary of State, or when Ken Blackwell or John Husted, or all the way back to Sherrod Brown when he was Ohio Secretary of State, it has been carried out, the state law for how we remove abandoned registrations from the rolls. And I think we all recognize that there has to be a way to maintain the accuracy of our voter rolls, to remove deceased and duplicate and those that have moved out of state, and that's the goal that everybody wants. But we also don't want to have this thing that that inconveniences those that are sort of infrequent voters, or removes those that are infrequent voters. So here's the approach I've taken. First of all, my oath of office obligates me to carry out the law of the state of Ohio. That's not optional. I have to do that, whether I like it or not. The responsible thing to do if you don't like the law is to work with the legislature to change it. I'm doing that. In fact, I was just on a conference call about this. We're working to modernize the way that we do registration in Ohio to create a more automated system so that anytime somebody comes into a Bureau of Motor Vehicles location, we can get them updated and this kind of thing. That would make this whole 6-year look-back thing superfluous. But at the same time, what I've been able to do is say, okay, I have to carry out this law. Let's find a way to do it better. And my idea was to use really transparency and collaboration to do that. And so what the law says is that on a certain day, I have to direct the boards of elections to remove those abandoned registrations that have been on the rolls for 6 years and have had no activity and haven't responded to multiple mailings and haven't come into a BMV and haven't done anything that could help reset that clock. But it doesn't say that I can't get that list together ahead of time. And so that's what we did. We put that list out this summer. I publicized it. I put it on the web. I worked with League of Women Voters and NAACP and Urban League and a bunch of labor organizations, and it was offered to both political parties. Only one party wanted to work with me for some reason. But we put it out there so that we could make the list better before the removals were ever processed. And here's what happened as a result. It's not surprising. We found errors that had been made by the county boards of elections. When you've got 88 different people typing on 88 different keyboards, working with 5 different databases that are supplied by all these different vendors, there's just room for human error. But we caught those this time. So instead of those being removed erroneously, we fixed it before the removal. That's a success story. Unfortunately, some folks want to play politics with these kind of things and say, oh, look at all these errors in it. Well, we fixed the errors now before we removed them. But we also were able to find a lot of people and get them to reactivate their registration. So it's a success story that well over 30,000 Ohioans are on the rolls today that wouldn't have been if we hadn't carried it out that way, and other states are starting to emulate it. So we're taking an antiquated, sort of broken old system and making it work using transparency and collaboration.
And just to turn to the flip side, sometimes you'll hear Republicans make the claim that bloated voter rolls, which I think it's more common to say in Democratic cities or in Democratic states, are not purged as frequently, leave the potential for voter fraud. Do you think that states are not aggressive enough in removing the dead wood? And do you think that the failure to do so raises an actual danger of fraudulent votes being cast?
I think the danger is misinformation of voters that causes them to lack faith in the integrity of the process. And I think that the goal is to lead with data and lead with facts and be transparent and say this is exactly what why the lists are the way they are, why they what we're doing to improve the accuracy of them. And what we're doing is 2 things. One, we joined ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which has been a tremendous help for us at really just improving the accuracy of our lists and collaborating with our colleagues around the country to do so. And then the second thing is the impact of automatic voter registration in our state, which we implemented in 5 months, thanks to the leadership of our elections director, Jonathan Brader, who came to us from the Brennan Center. I don't know if there's any Brennan Center alums in the house, but we use that expertise to, oh, sorry, oh, there they are. We used really, frankly, the expertise of so many people who've gone through this already to implement it effectively, efficiently. It helps that I also oversee the DMV in Michigan, which, by the way, makes me really popular. Everyone loves it all the time. But because of that, what we saw immediately upon implementing automatic voter registration through our office is that the accuracy, we found more than anything, more than even, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but more than even adding new people to the registration list, we were cleaning up and addressing errors in the list that were found through the AVR process. So that has been the best way that we can and are increasing the accuracy of the list. And then the frustrating thing, not just in this regard, but in so much of what we do to try to administer fair, accessible, secure elections, is that we're doing all this under the umbrella of this hyper-partisan process, which is what I was talking about earlier. And that's really, to me, the source of these whether it's a lawsuit or allegations or just misinformation about the accuracy of the list. And it's incredibly frustrating because you want to cut through it and talk to all voters about exactly what you're doing and exactly what's happening. I observed the same thing happen with Secretary LaRose as he went through his work in Ohio. It was really frustrating to observe because you want and we need well-intentioned, smart election administrators. And part of that means you have to have a willingness to do that work well in a system where you're under this constant battle against efforts to confuse voters about what's really happening and the sanctity and the integrity of the process, and thereby disenfranchise them by discouraging them to participate or having them participate with misinformation about various aspects of the election.
I want to turn to questions. A number of them are already about voter suppression, but let me last ask you from my set of questions about one of the nightmare scenarios I'm worried about, which is a cyber attack from a foreign force that knocks out the power grid in, say, Cleveland or Detroit. What's your plan? Do you have a plan? What happens if large numbers of people can't get to the polling places because there's, the lights are out?
It's a number of things. Yes, we have a plan. We have contingency plans for various different things that have happened or could happen. That's part of good election administration. Last cycle, ballots ran out in certain parts of Oakland County, and so we've got a plan now and instructions about what happens when you get low on ballots. So yes. However, contingency planning always also has to be flexible and nimble enough to prepare for any specifics of the whatever particular thing could happen that we can't anticipate. How long is the power grid out, for example, in what parts of the state? What's the source of it? What are the other aspects of state government that can be used and leveraged to improve things? That said, we both are in states where the ability to vote from home and vote absentee without a reason is on the rise, particularly in Michigan, where in this presidential primary that we're holding on March 10th, absentee ballot requests are up 77%. This is our first statewide election where you can vote absentee without a reason, but voting from home is up 77%. So that's a good thing from the contingency standpoint because it means a lot more people are going to be voting from home. It creates other challenges, getting those ballots in, tracking them, counting them, all those things. But in terms of election day challenges, it's in some ways mitigated if you have more people than ever voting, casting their ballots outside of the precincts. But then, of course, you have contingency plans for within the precincts, and that gets down to the details of, again, as I was saying earlier, exactly what's happened. And the last thing I'll just say on that is communication is key. And so part of our planning is really a communications plan and having people on the ground throughout the state, which we will have for the first time ever in every statewide election from our office, to be eyes and ears, to report back and to counter any misinformation that's happening throughout the state as well, because contingency planning isn't just for the big potential disasters, it's for smaller challenges that could occur as well.
Happy to say that in Ohio, we've had no fault absentee for like a decade and a half, so just saying.
Yeah, and as a result, you guys are further ahead, and we can talk more about that.
So
anyway,
the scenario, Rick...
We're still going to win the bet. You guys know about,
we'll talk about that in a minute. So, Rick, the scenario that you're laying out is one that causes a lot of concerns, right? And so localized power outages are one thing. A state or regional sized power outage starts to be quite another. There's a period of time that the battery backups will last. There's a period of time that it takes to mobilize the generator units. We've got thousands of polling locations. Newsflash, not all of them are on generator backups. It's just a fact. But what we do require is a certain volume of paper ballots available so that if there is a power outage, you can go to the paper ballots and that kind of thing, because we want to obviously capture that voter intent with whatever medium we need at that moment in time. The fact is, if there is a regional or statewide power outage, you're probably talking about a major public safety type of crisis at that point. And so if there's one thing that's more important than a fair and honest election, it's life and safety, life and health kind of concerns, and making sure that the public safety is maintained. And so that's when very difficult decisions have to be made about, is there an order to suspend the election day and to rerun it a different day? Those are difficult scenarios to consider. But let's hope we don't have to, right? But we're ready if that kind of thing does.
Who would be making
transpire.
that decision?
This is new ground, right? It would be probably me making a call to the governor to make a declaration. I don't know, but those are the kind of things that have to be thought through.
Yeah. So going to questions from the audience. We've heard previous panels report on the dangers to voter confidence from when late-counted ballots come in, especially if they lead to reversal of election night results. How important is it for election officials to report about how many ballots remain to be counted? Because often we hear 100% of precincts have reported, but yet there are thousands or more ballots still outstanding in some cases.
Yeah, and it's something that we're uniquely going to face this year in Michigan, with it being our first statewide election, with more people voting from home than ever before, therefore more ballots needing to be centrally counted. And as many of you may know, our laws in Michigan, unlike those in 18 other states, don't allow these ballots to be even begun to be processed until Election Day. So we are just, trying to work with a very partisan legislature to update our laws effectively. It's been a bigger, heavy lift than I thought it would be. We have a bipartisan coalition of clerks leading that effort. That said, setting expectations for the media as well as the general public, nationally and in our state, about our intention to be methodical with our results and our evaluation of the ballots and all the rest, to protect the integrity of the process, to not get too out in front when you think of how do you not become a Florida, how does Michigan not become the Florida of 2020 and or the Ohio of But you do it by making sure accuracy leads, and no one is out there calling the election one way or even hinting that it may be going one way when it ultimately goes another. That's where you run into the challenge and the problems. And so our goal is to frankly communicate, my goal, my office's goal, and hopefully our locality's goal is to communicate proactively on social media and with the media throughout the day and throughout the night to say this is exactly where we are, this is exactly where we are not, and make sure that our office, through that open communication, is working to avoid a pitfall where any insinuation of any winner is made before really there's any clarity for sure. And I say all that to say, so even if it was like, 58% of the ballots have been counted, yet, and this person's ahead, you're still running into treacherous potential territory because we don't know the results of the other 42%. And so we're going to try to minimize the possibility of that type of prognosticating happen as much as we can by generating our own proactive content on what is actually happening, what the numbers actually mean, what's actually not been counted, with an eye towards ensuring accuracy rules the day.
Civics education. It's kind of like we're all getting a crash course in public health administration right now, right? If you turn on the news, we're all learning more than we thought we would ever know about containing a pandemic or what have you. And so this is one of those where hopefully the American public doesn't have to get a crash course in civics education about the fact that when you see results on election night, we all know those are unofficial results, right? But the John Q. public doesn't pay attention to that unofficial result part. They don't know that the election's not certified until days and days later. The idea that those outstanding ballots are men and women serving overseas and their families and our overseas civilians and all of these things that still we have to resolve the provisional ballots that are out there. And so hopefully we can as opinion leaders, as thought leaders can help educate people on the fact that when you see the results on election night, that's for convenience. That's an unofficial result. It's not the final tally, and it doesn't mean that if it changes that something nefarious is happening, as unfortunately some people have claimed.
So I have a few questions here about something we heard about this morning, which are risk-limiting audits, more precise audits to make sure that voting machines are accurately reporting results. What's your stance on it? What's your state's each of your states' positions on it, and do you see us moving nationally in that direction?
We've been piloting, working with experts in the field to pilot risk-limiting audits for the past year and throughout 2019. Thank you for those of you here who've been helping with that. We intend to have statewide risk-limiting audits in place this year, if not by March 10th, certainly by August and November. It is something that has both been mandated to us by voters and also that we have taken on with our clerk community and with an eye towards, again, everyone recognizing that, in our view, this is the most statistically reliable way of ensuring our ballots are being accurately counted. We're actually now, frankly, moving to the position, yes, we're working to implement those, and I see this happening nationally as well. The conversations are already, well, what's the next iteration of even more accurate post-election audits? What's that going to look like? How can we continue to build on accuracy, improve the audit process, recognizing that the questions surrounding the accuracy of our voting machines is only going to continue to be a part of the discourse moving forward. So I see the conversation moving in the direction of what's the next iteration of post-election audits or accuracy testing for our machines, but certainly risk-limiting audits are, in my opinion, becoming the norm nationally, certainly in Michigan and in many other states, than not.
Big fan of risk-limiting audits. I require all counties in Ohio to do post-election audits. We don't mandate that they be risk-limiting audits, although several of our counties have and some have for a long time. And we actually just got our state law changed to make it a matter of state law that it's a requirement that we do post-election audits. With Brennan Center and with many others, we did a pilot sort of showing that we can do it in our small rural counties and we can do it in our big urban counties. Cuyahoga County, for example, has done it for years and years. It's one of our largest counties in Ohio. But we had a few smaller rural counties that showed that they can make it work too, and they carried it off very well. My other thing about risk-limiting audits or any other kind of audit that you can do is that you have to tell people that you're doing it, and it's hard. It's not a visual thing necessarily, but it's hard to get the press to report on this. But it's like if a tree falls in the wood and nobody hears it, does the tree really fall? If you do a post-election audit and nobody knows that you did it, does it do anything to help lift voter confidence? I would say no. So we're now not only doing our post-election audits, but we're trying to make sure people know that we did them. And this is just one more way that they can know that their vote was accurately counted.
Well, I've got a huge stack of additional questions, but Secretary Benson has a plane to catch in 45 minutes. Oh, you're good? All right, so we can, all right. All right, so we'll take, oh, great. So we have time then for 5 more minutes of questions. Can exit polls play a role in detecting the hack of a political system?
Maybe.
Okay.
Just another data set, right? It's the more data, the better, as long as it's accurately captured.
I think there are a lot of other ways to determine, but I think it could go either way. But.
There are a number of questions here about voter fraud, some asking about non-citizen voting. Can you talk about the rate at which voter fraud is detected in your state and what kind of things you see, and is it a major problem?
Infinitesimally small, thankfully. And the good news is that we work to keep it that way, right? I mean, there's no acceptable level of voter fraud. It's not like we say, oh, we're going to put up with a certain level. We do smart things to prevent voter fraud. Maintaining accurate lists is just one of them. In Ohio, I'm required to carry out a section of the Ohio Code that we do an annual inspection of the voter rolls to remove non-citizens. When we do that, we generally find like a couple dozen, maybe just over 100 or whatever, depending on the cycle. And so, it's a small number. The other one is multi-state voters. That ends up being very small. We work with ERIC. I know now Michigan works with ERIC as well, and that's a great thing. When we did that last, I think I referred just a few dozen for prosecution that had voted in Ohio and in another state. And so it's a tiny number, but we take it seriously because, we're not going to turn our head when somebody's violating the law.
All right, last question for each of you. If you could become the election czar of your state, so you could change the law, what's the one thing you would change to make elections more secure or voters more confident in November?
I mean, there's so much. There's little stuff. I mean, I could tell you we want. We need the legislature to agree 70 days before an election what the ballot's going to look like because we got to get ballots in people's hands 40 days out. I mean, things like that. There are like very minutia details. We want people to be able to process absentee ballots before election day so that we can just focus on running elections on election day. So just there's a lot of the minutia. Well, I would say this as someone again who's been a part of this community for a long time. What I've seen most as Secretary of State, as an administrator, is those, many of you know this, the policies that automatic voter registration, risk limiting audits. I walked into office and I had all of these at my doorstep enacted by voters in 2018 when I was elected. Automatic voter reg, election day registration, voting by mail. Our job began with implementation and funding, and working through these specific details is critical to their success. And so a lot of our time has been spent on that. So there's a lot of little things that I would want to just fix in our election code, and honestly, one of the things I want to do after this cycle is just sit down with a bipartisan coalition of legislators and say, let's rewrite this code and look at what we act, because it's so piecemeal and so contradictory, and let's just fix it and clean it up. So one, that needs to happen, and then a dedicated source of federal funding for our elections is critical. We spent a lot of time going to Congress, as all of y'all know, with many of you, asking for year after year, security funding and all the rest, support for the EAC, and it would be really nice if we just did not have to keep negotiating and debating that every budget cycle, and we had a dedicated source of money for elections, for election security, and to support the important work that the EAC has been doing for a number of years, and is increasingly doing so even more effectively than in the past.
Once again, great minds think alike. I love the thing that you're talking about with rewriting and sort of recodifying your elections law statute. I have the same goal in Ohio. Title 35 is our election code. It's a kind of a patchwork quilt, and it even contradicts itself in certain places, and it just needs to be reorganized and rewritten. That's a post-presidential election kind of an endeavor. There's a variety of things that I'm trying to get done that we're working through the legislature to do right now. One of them is to create statewide standards, and eventually we need to see federal standards for the systems that do our voter registration. And so right now, if you're a vendor that can come up with some database to provide voter registration for a state or a locality, then there's no standards that you have to abide by. It's not like, with the physical machines, the voting machines, we test every nut and bolt on them over and over again. But with something as crucial as a voter registration database, it's like, oh yeah, build us a database and we'll start using it. We need to have those tested as well. Sorry?
Yeah, I want to add one thing.
Jump in.
Are you done?
No, not yet, but go for it.
Oh, no, I was just realizing the poll worker piece.
Yeah,
But
poll worker training.
and funding for poll workers. I mean, if now I'm really thinking, we need to rework how we need good people running elections at every level. And for those, we need the positions to be well funded, and we need support for educating and certifying those officials at every level. So increasing the expertise of those who are running elections, including poll workers.
We were able to convince our state Supreme Court to offer CLE credits for people that work the polls. I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but we're going to see. But it's one way to incentivize it. So a couple other things that I'm working at our legislature to do right now is, again, to modernize the way that we do voter registration, to create what some people have called automatic voter registration. I tend to not use that term because for some reason it causes people in my party to break out in hives or something, but what it is simply a modern way of doing it. I've said it's kind of like when you go through the checkout at most stores, they ask you to verify your email address, and that's because they want to send you marketing material. So when we've got somebody there at the BMV, why don't we just make sure that we have the right voting address for them? And if they're not already registered, let's get them registered right there with an API where their database talks to my database, and it should be a simple thing, but it's something that we're working to get done. To make it easier for people to vote by mail, I want to put the absentee ballot request online. Right now, you have to print out a piece of paper and mail it to your county board of elections. That should be online to request that, and then
You
the
can
state
fix that
should
by
pay
election day, right?
What's that?
Can you fix that by election day, or do you need legislation to do it?
It takes legislation, unfortunately. Yeah, but we should also pay the postage. I know California does. And then the long-term thing that I'd like to see, and this is not a proposal that I'm going to make tomorrow, but this is something I'd like to see Ohio move to, is that vote center model that I know that they're doing here in Orange County and other places in California as well, a much more efficient way of administering elections, particularly as we start to approach that 50% threshold where almost half the ballots are going to be cast through early voting and vote by mail. Being able to have that vote center model is a way to have both that election day experience and the for people that want that, but also have the efficiencies.
Well, it's nice to end a panel without utter despair, as we have with some of the others.
I just want to ask a question. I have an ask for the folks here. I have benefited in my office so much from the experts who have come to support us, to work with us, the Center for Civic Design, redesigning our absentee ballots and our absentee ballot envelopes. We are under-resourced as state governments, and I know we're all under-resourced, but you have an expertise that oftentimes we have not been able to take advantage of because we've been siloed for various reasons. And I think the two of us are not siloing ourselves. Well, I don't want to speak for you, but I think so, right? We welcome that expertise, and we've been working with so many of you already in this regard. So my email is just secretary@michigan.gov. But as you know, we've set up various task forces. As a former dean of a law school, as someone who started in this work as an election law academic, I know the value and importance of implementing so many of the ideas that this community is generating, testing them, piloting them. So use us, my office, as opportunities to explore even bigger ways of doing things, because I want us to also keep innovating and creating. We actually have an Office of Innovation in my office that I created, and I don't want us to just be innovating on our own. I want to rely on many of you who've been doing this work for decades and know so much about it to help us continue to serve the field and the work that we're all invested in improving democracy for everyone.
Rick, if I echo that, there are a lot of folks in here that we've already worked with. You mentioned Center for Civic Design. We're working with them, and Brennan and Vote. So many people in here. Thank you for all that you all do. I'm happy to continue working with you all as well. In fact, I look forward to doing so. And come visit us in the Great Lakes states. I don't know if you've noticed, but we have a large
come
role.
when the weather's a little
Yeah,
better.
sure. We have a large role. Come in November. There's a little contest that we have after the election, of course. But
Actually, at the Ohio State game, Frank's going to be singing the Michigan fight song
which is not true. No.
because we're going to have higher turnout.
We were
So-
keeping this very civil.
Well, we have a wager, and it's not about what happens on the football field because that's become very predictable. It's about what happens at the polls. And so when the civic-minded people of Ohio show up in record numbers, the Michigan Secretary of State is going to be wearing scarlet and gray at the Ohio State-Michigan game. And so there's
I'll
going
have
to be...
to sing whatever fight song that
Yeah.
you... But if Michigan beats Ohio in turnout, Frank will have to sing the Michigan fight song in Columbus, which is where the Michigan-Ohio State game is happening just a few weeks after Election Day. And so I'm excited for that. But here's the thing that we actually realized long after we made this very public bet. Michigan and Ohio have actually been very, very close. Many of you probably know this, within like a few tenths of a percentage point for a number of presidential cycles. So it actually is a really competitive bet. We're having a lot of fun with it, as you can see. But it's something that, keep an eye out for it and see what happens. And,
And let me share, thank you. Let me share my email address as well. Mine's just frank@ohiosos.gov. When you're the guy in charge, you get to use your first name, I guess. So frank@ohiosos.gov. And so look forward to hearing from all of you. And yes, go Buckeyes. Thank you.
Thanks.
I did not read those comments about the various football teams that do appear on some of these cards. Thank you both very much. Please join me in
Thank you.
thanking our speaker. We'll take a 5-minute break. We're running a little bit behind. 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for our next panel.